I'm a 29-year-old guy, the oldest of three siblings, and I guess you could say I'm the successful one in my family. I graduated from college with honors, landed a solid job in tech, and now live in a nice condo I bought a couple of years ago. My younger siblings, my 27-year-old brother and 24-year-old sister, are doing okay but still figuring out their paths. My dad, on the other hand, has always been a wild card. Growing up, my family was never well off. My dad worked random jobs, everything from landscaping to delivering pizzas, while my mom stretched every penny to make sure we had food on the table. Despite my dad's unpredictable income, he acted like money was no big deal. He'd splurge on things we didn't need or go out with friends while my mom quietly took on extra hours at her part-time job. Meanwhile, I was the kid cutting coupons and helping my mom balance the grocery budget. Fast forward to last month. My dad is now 57 and has been hinting about slowing down for years. At a recent family dinner, he dropped the bombshell he's retiring early. He said it casually like he was telling us about the weather. My siblings and I exchanged glances, waiting for him to explain. My brother asked how he planned to afford it, and my dad just waved him off, saying he had everything figured out. That was the end of it, for the night, anyway. A few days later, my mom called me and asked if I could stop by their house. She sounded weird, so I figured it was serious. When I got there, she looked stressed and started talking about how family takes care of family. Then she told me what my dad's plan really was. He expected me to support him financially. He thought, since I make the most money, it was my duty to step in and pay for his bills, groceries, and basically everything else. I honestly thought it was a joke at first. My dad has always been the kind of guy who laughs things off, so I asked her if she was serious. She nodded, and that's when I realized this wasn't some misunderstanding. He actually thought I'd bankroll his early retirement. I confronted him about it that evening. He didn't even deny it. He went on about how he sacrificed his younger years working to provide for us, and how it was only fair that I repay the favor. The part that really got me? He said I should be grateful to have the chance to take care of him. I told him straight up that I wasn't doing it. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I have my own life to take care of. He didn't take it well. He called me selfish and said I was turning my back on family. My mom just stood there, not saying a word. When I asked why he didn't make any plans for retirement, he brushed it off, saying he didn't think he'd need to, because family steps in. After that, things escalated quickly. My siblings got dragged into it. My brother said he couldn't afford to help since he's still paying off student loans, and my sister, who's in grad school, said she didn't make enough. Somehow, that made it worse, because my dad decided that since I'm the most successful, I'm the one who should step up. The extended family got wind of the situation, and I started getting calls from aunts, uncles, and even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. They all had opinions, most of them siding with my dad. They said things like, "He's your father, he raised you, and it's your responsibility now." Some even implied that I was being ungrateful. Meanwhile, my dad was playing the victim, telling everyone that he'd worked so hard for his family and now his own son was abandoning him. I felt like I was being ganged up on from all sides. My mom wasn't helping either. She kept repeating that family takes care of family and said she didn't want to see the family torn apart over money. When I asked why she wasn't stepping in to mediate, she said it was between me and my dad. At this point, I turned to the internet. I posted my story on Reddit, hoping for advice, or at least some validation. The response was overwhelming. Most people were on my side, sharing their own stories about entitled parents and reminding me that I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my financial future for someone else's poor planning. Some even suggested I consult a lawyer to protect myself in case my dad tried to make me legally responsible for him. It's been a few weeks now, and my dad has stopped speaking to me. He told my siblings he's done with me and that I'm not welcome at family gatherings unless I apologize. I'm still getting calls and messages from extended family, and my brother has started hinting that I should just help out a little to keep the peace. My sister, thankfully, hasn't said much, but I can tell she's uncomfortable. Honestly, I don't know where things go from here. My dad seems convinced he's in the right, and the family drama is only getting worse. For now, I'm sticking to my decision, but part of me wonders if I made the right call. Update 1. It's been a month since my dad announced his early retirement plan, and things have spiraled completely out of control. I thought the situation was bad when my dad stopped talking to me, but that was just the beginning. He's been on a full-blown campaign to paint me as the villain, and now the entire family is involved. The first sign was the calls. At first, it was just a couple of aunts telling me they'd heard I wasn't supporting my dad. They acted like I had some moral obligation, bringing up how he worked so hard to provide for us growing up. It was clear my dad had fed them a very one-sided version of the story, leaving out the part where he expected me to completely bankroll his retirement. I tried to explain, but they weren't interested in hearing my side. Then came the messages. My phone started blowing up with texts from cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were blunt, accusing me of being ungrateful. Others were passive-aggressive, saying things like, "I hope you realize how much he sacrificed for you." It was exhausting. In the middle of all this, my younger brother decided he couldn't take the guilt anymore. Without telling me or my sister, he offered to help my dad financially. My dad jumped at the chance, but it wasn't enough to cover everything he wanted. That's when my dad's demands grew. It wasn't just about paying the bills anymore, he wanted a monthly allowance to live comfortably. My brother, who's still paying off student loans, clearly couldn't afford it, but he didn't back down. Instead, he started blaming me for putting him in this position, saying if I had just helped in the first place, none of this would be happening. My mom stayed quiet through all of this. Whenever I tried to get her to step in and mediate, she just said it was between me and my dad. She acted like she was caught in the middle, but I knew she wasn't completely innocent. She'd always supported my dad's unrealistic ideas, even when they didn't make sense. I updated my Reddit post, venting about how the situation was tearing my family apart. The responses were overwhelming, with people telling me I needed to set firm boundaries and protect myself. Some suggested consulting a lawyer in case my dad tried to pull something sneaky, like claiming financial dependency. Others just shared their own stories about entitled parents, which weirdly made me feel less alone. One of the most stressful parts was dealing with my dad's public Facebook post. He wrote this vague rant about kids who forget where they came from and how he gave everything for his family, only to be abandoned. He didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who he was talking about. That post got a ton of comments from extended family and old family friends, all offering their support and sympathy. Some of them even messaged me directly to scold me. The stress started affecting my work. I'd find myself distracted, rereading the same email 5 times because I couldn't focus. My friends noticed something was off and asked what was going on. When I told them, they were shocked but immediately supportive. A few of them even offered to help me draft responses to the more aggressive family messages, but I decided it was better to just ignore them. One cousin reached out to say they understood where I was coming from. They'd seen my dad's post and had a feeling there was more to the story. It was a small relief to know at least one person in the family was on my side, but it didn't make the overall situation any less draining. Around this time, my dad escalated things further. He started threatening to move in with me if I didn't step up and help him financially. He even went so far as to say it was my responsibility to give him a place to live since he had nowhere else to go. I told him that wasn't an option, but the stress of it all was getting to me. I decided to start therapy to help me process everything and figure out how to handle the constant guilt and pressure. One of the most surprising moments came when I checked in on my sister. She'd been pretty quiet through all of this, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. To my surprise, she admitted she thought my dad's expectations were ridiculous and didn't blame me for standing my ground. It was nice to have her support, even if it was just between the two of us. Meanwhile, my brother was still trying to juggle supporting my dad and paying his own bills. He complained constantly but refused to confront my dad or set boundaries. It felt like he was trying to guilt me into stepping in, but I wasn't budging. By the end of the month, I'd had enough. I froze my credit and started looking into legal options, just in case my dad tried to pull something shady. I wasn't going to let him drag me down with his poor financial planning. It's been a nightmare, but I'm determined to stick to my boundaries, no matter how much it costs me emotionally. Update 2. After freezing my credit and deciding to hold firm, I followed the advice I'd gotten from Reddit and booked a consultation with a lawyer. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wanted to be prepared in case my dad tried something sneaky, like claiming financial dependency or opening accounts in my name. The lawyer walked me through some steps I could take to protect myself. He suggested monitoring my credit regularly, drafting a formal letter to my dad outlining my boundaries, and documenting any interactions that could become problematic later. The next week, I sat down with my budget and made a clear plan to ensure I wouldn't cave under guilt. I allocated every dollar of my income, from savings to bills, so there would be no room for my dad's demands. I wanted to make sure if he tried to pressure me, I'd have a solid response ready. I've already allocated my funds. Meanwhile, my younger brother was struggling. He had offered to help my dad financially, but it quickly became clear he couldn't keep up. Between his student loans, rent, and now my dad's growing list of expenses, he was barely staying afloat. Instead of backing off, my dad doubled down. He started hinting that my brother wasn't doing enough and added new expenses to his budget. My brother vented about it to me, but instead of directing his frustration at my dad, he blamed me. He claimed if I had just helped from the beginning, my dad wouldn't have leaned so heavily on him. At work, things were finally looking up. I got a promotion, which meant more money and more opportunities for growth. I didn't broadcast the news, but my mom found out and of course told my dad. That turned into another issue. My dad called my siblings to complain about how I was rolling in money but refused to help him. My brother and I had another argument about it, while my sister stayed quiet. Therapy became a lifeline. My therapist helped me focus on what I could control and reminded me that it wasn't my responsibility to fix my dad's poor financial choices. Slowly, the guilt started to ease, and I found it easier to hold my ground during the constant family pressure. I decided to try something drastic, a family meeting. I invited my siblings and parents over to my place, hoping we could have an honest discussion and maybe find some middle ground. That was a mistake. My dad showed up with a list of his monthly expenses and handed it to me as soon as he walked in. He expected me to start covering everything from his utilities to his car payment. The conversation quickly turned into a shouting match. My dad accused me of abandoning him, my brother sided with him, and my sister left halfway through because the tension was too much. After the disaster of the meeting, my dad's tactics escalated. He started telling everyone his health was deteriorating, implying that I was ignoring his medical needs. I knew he wasn't in great shape, but these new claims seemed exaggerated. I posted another update on Reddit, asking for advice on how to handle manipulative parents. The responses were both comforting and infuriating. People shared their stories, confirming that I wasn't alone, but it was clear this situation wasn't going to resolve itself anytime soon. A surprising moment came when my mom finally opened up to me. She admitted she was exhausted by my dad's entitlement, but felt trapped. She said she didn't know how to confront him and was afraid of making things worse. I asked why she stayed quiet during the family meeting, and she said she felt caught between her role as his wife and her own frustrations. Not long after that, I got an email from my dad. Attached was an itemized list of his expenses, totaling over $3,000 a month. He wasn't even subtle about it, he flat out said he expected me to pay. I ignored the email, but he followed up with passive-aggressive posts on Facebook. He shared memes about selfish kids and how real families take care of each other. Mutual friends started commenting, and it felt like the drama was bleeding into every part of my life. Despite the chaos, there was one bright spot. My sister called me and said she was starting to see things differently. She'd always tried to stay neutral, but after seeing how far my dad was willing to push, she admitted she understood why I was standing firm. It was a relief to have her support, even if it didn't solve the bigger problem. My most recent Reddit update reached our best of Redditor updates, and the outpouring of support was incredible. Strangers shared their own stories of cutting ties with toxic family members and encouraged me to stay strong. It was validating to know I wasn't alone, even if my family didn't see it that way. The latest twist came when my dad sent another email, this time threatening to cut me out of his will if I didn't comply. He framed it as an ultimatum, but honestly it felt more like desperation. I'm not sure what's next, but one thing is clear, I'm not backing down. Update 3. I wasn't expecting my dad to show up at my condo, but that's exactly what happened last Saturday. I was getting ready for the day when I heard loud banging on my door. I checked the peephole and saw him standing there, looking furious. He wasn't just knocking, he was slamming his fist on the door like it was an emergency. I opened the door slightly, just enough to ask him what he was doing. He pushed his way in without waiting for an invitation. I was caught off guard, but I managed to step back before he barreled into me. He immediately started talking about how I needed to reconsider my decision and that I was destroying the family. He had a folder with him, which he slapped onto my dining table, saying it was proof of how bad his situation was. I didn't even look at the papers. I told him he couldn't just show up at my place unannounced and that he needed to leave. He ignored me completely and kept talking, pacing back and forth like he owned the place. He pointed out every little thing in my condo, my TV, my furniture, my appliances, and said things like, "You can afford all this, but you can't help your own father?" When I realized he wasn't going to leave, I called the police. I didn't want to, but I didn't see another option. He noticed me on the phone and tried to grab it out of my hand, yelling that I was overreacting and being disrespectful. That's when I locked myself in my bedroom and stayed there until the police arrived. They escorted him out, and I could hear him arguing with them, saying I was his son and he had every right to be there. I didn't press charges, but I made it clear to the officers that I didn't want him coming back. They warned him to stay away, and he eventually left, but not before calling me a disgrace loud enough for half my building to hear. The fallout from that incident was immediate. My younger brother called me later that day, furious. He accused me of humiliating our dad and said I was taking things too far. He didn't care about the unannounced visit or the fact that my dad had forced his way in. All he cared about was that I had called the police. My sister, on the other hand, was completely on my side. She told me she thought it was about time someone stood up to him, and that she wished she had the courage to do the same. My mom reached out the next day. She apologized for my dad's behavior, but it felt half-hearted. She kept saying things like, "You know how he is," and "he didn't mean any harm." She refused to hold him accountable, and I could tell she just wanted me to smooth things over. I told her I wasn't going to, and that I needed space from both of them. I talked about everything in therapy that week, and for the first time, I felt like I was prioritizing my mental health over the constant family drama. My therapist helped me come up with strategies for setting even firmer boundaries and reminded me that it was okay to put my well-being first. I also told my boss about the situation, and they were understanding enough to give me a mental health day to recover. It was a small relief in the middle of all the chaos. I posted an update on Reddit, sharing what had happened, and the support was overwhelming. People encouraged me to file a restraining order if my dad showed up again, and some even shared stories about how they dealt with similar situations. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone and that I wasn't crazy for setting boundaries. The family division grew even deeper after the incident. My sister fully sided with me and stopped taking calls from my dad and brother, which only made my dad angrier. Meanwhile, my brother was still trying to defend him, even though he was starting to struggle financially himself. I learned through my sister that my dad had taken out a personal loan recently, which he couldn't repay, and was now trying to guilt my brother into helping with that too. It was a mess. My sister and I started brainstorming how we could handle the situation together. She suggested we look into legal options to make sure our dad couldn't claim financial dependency on US or open any accounts in our names. I reached out to my lawyer again and started filing the necessary paperwork. It felt good to finally take proactive steps instead of just reacting to every new crisis. Of course, my dad wasn't done. He started leaving tearful voice messages, begging me to reconsider and saying things like, "You're all I have left." I ignored them, but it was exhausting. Then he threatened to sell off family heirlooms, claiming it was my fault he had to resort to such measures. I knew I couldn't keep engaging with him, so I decided to cut him off completely. I blocked him on every platform, phone, email, social media, and told my mom and brother I didn't want any updates about him. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt necessary. My latest Reddit update blew up, getting over 20,000 upvotes. The encouragement from strangers has been incredible, and hearing others share their stories of going no contact has given me the strength to stick to my decision. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm finally taking control of my life. Update 4. After cutting my dad off, things were quiet for a few weeks. No messages, no random visitors, nothing. For the first time in a long while, I started to feel like I could breathe. I focused on my job, kept going to therapy, and spent more time with my younger sister. She was the only family member who really understood my side of things, and we'd started to grow closer because of it. Then, out of nowhere, my mom reached out. She hadn't called me in weeks, so I assumed she was siding with my dad like usual. Her tone was different this time. She said she needed to talk to me in person about something important. I was skeptical. The last thing I wanted was another guilt trip or some new scheme to rope me back into the drama. But she sounded serious, and part of me wanted to know what was going on. I agreed to meet her at a neutral spot, a coffee shop near my place. I brought my sister along just in case. When we sat down, my mom looked worn out, like she hadn't slept in days. She started talking about how difficult things had been with my dad lately. At first, I thought it was going to be the usual spiel about how I needed to make amends, but then she dropped a bombshell. My dad had been gambling for years, and that's why he was broke. I couldn't believe it. She explained that it started small with scratch-offs and the occasional trip to the casino, but it had spiraled out of control. Apparently, he'd been using his paycheck to cover his losses, which is why he was never able to save anything. It got worse when he started taking out loans to cover his debts. That's why he was so desperate for me to support him. He wasn't just broke, he was drowning in gambling debt. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. My mom admitted that years ago, when I was a teenager, my dad had cashed out part of my college savings to cover one of his bigger losses. She said she'd kept it a secret because she didn't want to disrupt the family. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. All those years I'd worked part-time jobs and applied for scholarships to get through school, thinking we didn't have the money, and this was why. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My mom started crying, saying she regretted not stopping him but felt powerless. She talked about how she'd spent years trying to hold everything together, hoping he'd change. She said she felt guilty for enabling him but didn't know what else to do. My sister sat there in stunned silence, and I just let my mom talk. There wasn't much I could say at that moment. After the meeting, I shared what happened with my sister in more detail. She was furious, not just with our dad but with our mom for covering it up. It shifted her perspective on everything, and I could tell she was starting to see just how deep this dysfunction ran. We decided to be more proactive about protecting ourselves from any more fallout. I updated Reddit again, sharing the new information about the gambling and the college fund. The response was overwhelming. People were outraged on my behalf, and many shared similar stories about parents who hid financial problems until it was too late. Some gave practical advice, like keeping an eye on my credit report in case my dad tried anything shady. That turned out to be excellent advice. A few days later, my mom called me again, this time with more bad news. She'd found paperwork suggesting my dad had been trying to open credit cards in my name. Thankfully, he hadn't succeeded, but it was enough to send me into action. I checked my credit report immediately and froze everything again just to be safe. I also filed paperwork to make sure he couldn't claim financial dependency on me in any way. When my dad found out about the meeting with my mom, he completely lost it. He started calling my sister and me traitors and accused my mom of plotting against him. He told my brother that we were trying to turn the family against him, which only fueled the division. My brother refused to believe the gambling story, saying it was just an excuse my mom made up to justify not helping my dad. At this point, my mom seemed to be at her breaking point. She hinted that she was considering separating from my dad, but she wasn't ready to take any real steps yet. She said she was tired of living like this but didn't know how to leave after so many years. It was hard to feel sorry for her after everything she'd kept hidden, but I could tell she was genuinely struggling. Despite the chaos, I kept focusing on rebuilding my life. Therapy helped me work through the anger and betrayal, and my bond with my sister continued to grow stronger. We talked about the future, about how we could break the cycle of dysfunction in our family. For the first time, it felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Update 5. After everything that happened with my dad, I thought things couldn't get worse, but I was wrong. Word started spreading among the extended family about his gambling addiction, and suddenly the people who had been on his side weren't so quick to defend him anymore. I heard through a cousin that he'd been calling relatives one by one, asking for money. At first, a few of them helped, but once the truth about his debts came out, most of them stopped taking his calls. The news of his financial troubles seemed to reach everyone except my younger brother. Despite all the evidence, he refused to believe my dad's gambling was as bad as my mom and I said. Instead, he doubled down on supporting him. Against my advice, he took out a small loan to help cover some of my dad's outstanding bills. It wasn't long before he started complaining about how tight his finances were, but he still wouldn't admit that enabling my dad was part of the problem. In the middle of all this, I got some good news at work. My boss offered me a significant promotion, one that came with a much bigger paycheck and more responsibilities. It felt like a validation of everything I'd been working toward, but I kept the news quiet. I didn't want to give my dad any more ammunition to guilt me, and I knew my brother would just use it as another excuse to call me selfish. Therapy continued to help me process everything. My therapist guided me through letting go of the guilt and resentment I'd been carrying for years. It wasn't easy, but I started to feel lighter, like I was finally taking control of my own life. I also updated Reddit again, sharing how far I'd come. That post got over 25,000 upvotes, with countless people cheering me on and telling me how proud they were of the boundaries I'd set. Reading those comments was a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Then, out of nowhere, I received a handwritten letter from my dad. It was the first time I'd heard from him directly since cutting him off. The letter started with an apology. He said he was sorry for how things had escalated and admitted he'd made mistakes. But as I kept reading, it became clear that the apology wasn't entirely genuine. He spent most of the letter justifying his actions and ended by subtly asking for help again. It was the same old pattern, just dressed up in different words. I didn't respond. I've learned that no contact is the healthiest option for me, and I wasn't about to break it. Meanwhile, my mom started taking small steps toward independence. She got a part-time job and eventually moved in with a supportive relative. It wasn't a complete separation from my dad, but it was a start. She called me one day to tell me about her new job, and for the first time in a while, she sounded hopeful. I didn't press her about whether she'd leave my dad for good. I figured that was a decision she had to make on her own. One of the biggest surprises came from my sister. She and I sat down with my brother to try and talk some sense into him. We explained how enabling our dad was only making things worse, but he wouldn't budge. He kept saying that helping was the right thing to do, and that I was being too harsh. It wasn't a productive conversation, but at least my sister and I left feeling more united in our approach. A small victory came when I heard my dad had started selling off some of his personal belongings to cover his expenses. These were things he'd sworn he'd never part with, so it was a big deal. It didn't solve his financial problems, but it was a step toward taking responsibility, even if it was just a small one. Through all of this, my friends were my biggest source of support. They organized a dinner to celebrate my promotion and everything I'd accomplished despite the family drama. Sitting there with them, I realized just how much I'd leaned on them over the past few months, and how lucky I was to have people in my life who truly had my back. Now, I'm starting to think about the future in a way I haven't before. I've been saving for years, and with my promotion, I'm finally in a position to consider buying a house. I've started looking at homes in a different city. A fresh start feels like exactly what I need. The idea of building something entirely my own, far away from the chaos, is exciting. Looking back, I'm proud of the boundaries I've set and the healthier relationships I've built with the people who truly support me. It hasn't been easy, and there are still moments when the guilt tries to creep back in, but I remind myself how far I've come. For the first time in a long time, I feel like my life is truly my own, and I'm excited to see what comes next. I'm Lucas, 30 years old, and I need some advice about a pretty messy family situation. My siblings Zach, 28, and Emma, 26, and I have been trying to plan a memorial for our mom, who passed away 3 months ago. She and my dad were married for over 30 years, and her death has been hard on all of us. She was the kind of person who held the whole family together, always there for us with a kind word or a warm meal. Losing her left a huge hole in our lives, but I think it hit Dad the hardest. Initially, Dad was a wreck. He cried a lot, barely left the house, and just seemed lost without her. We all tried to support him, taking turns checking in on him. But then, just about a month after she passed, he started seeing someone new, a woman named Kim, who's about 10 years younger than him. It took us by surprise. It felt way too soon, but we kept quiet, thinking he was just trying to cope. We figured maybe he was trying to fill the void, even if it hurt to see him move on so quickly. Then, about 2 weeks before the memorial we'd been planning, Dad casually dropped some unexpected news. He mentioned he'd be bringing Kim to the service. He said it like it was no big deal, like it was just another Sunday family dinner or something. I remember the awkward silence that followed. It felt like a punch in the gut. Emma and Zach were just as shocked as I was, and we told him right then and there that it was a terrible idea. This memorial was supposed to be about honoring Mom's memory, and having his new girlfriend there felt disrespectful. It hadn't even been 3 months since she passed, but Dad didn't see it that way. He said Kim had been a huge support for him, and that he didn't want to face the memorial alone. He tried to make it sound like it was about him needing support, but it just didn't sit right with any of us. We couldn't understand why he couldn't lean on his own kids instead. Emma suggested that maybe he could bring Kim around after the memorial, give us some time to adjust before introducing her to the family. But he shot that down quickly, saying that it wouldn't be fair to Kim to hide her away. So the three of us had our own meeting without Dad to talk it out. We met up at Emma's apartment and vented about the whole situation. Zach was furious, Emma was upset, and I think we were all a little bit confused. It wasn't just about Kim coming to the memorial, it brought up a lot of old stuff between Dad and Mom, especially the way he had been when she was sick. He was there physically, but he wasn't really there. He kept himself busy with work, leaving Mom to handle a lot of the emotional burden alone. Seeing him move on so fast made it feel like he had never really appreciated what he had with her. We tried to find a middle ground, but it felt impossible. Every time we thought about Dad bringing Kim to the memorial, it just felt wrong. We wanted to focus on celebrating Mom's life, not dealing with the drama of meeting Dad's new girlfriend. But when we suggested that to Dad, he shut it down immediately. He was adamant, either Kim came, or he wouldn't show up at all. That turned everything into a standoff, and the tension in the house was unbearable. To make things worse, Kim started getting involved directly. She reached out to Zach, messaging him to explain how much she cared for Dad and how she just wanted to support him through this difficult time. It came off as manipulative, like she was trying to win us over behind Dad's back. Zach showed us the messages, and we all agreed that it wasn't her place to try and smooth things over. She barely knew us, and it just felt like she was overstepping. It didn't take long for the drama to spread to the rest of the family. Our aunts and uncles got wind of the situation and were just as horrified as we were. They couldn't believe that Dad would bring someone new to something so personal, so soon after losing Mom. They called him out, but he accused them of meddling in his life. It turned into this huge mess with family members taking sides and giving their opinions. It was like every time we tried to make things right, the whole situation just got messier. Emma, being the peacemaker, tried to start a group chat with all of us and Dad, hoping we could clear the air. But that blew up in our faces too. It quickly turned into an argument that left us all more divided than ever. Dad accused us of trying to control his life, and we told him he wasn't thinking about how this would affect us. It got so heated that Zach left the chat entirely, and Emma was in tears. It felt like any hope of finding a compromise was slipping away. And then memories started flooding back, times when Dad wasn't there for Mom, how distant he had been during her final months. It made his insistence on bringing Kim to the memorial feel like another betrayal. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to rewrite history, moving on like none of it mattered. It got to a point where I didn't know what else to do, so I turned to Reddit for advice, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone out there had been through something similar. I wrote it all out, not really expecting much, but the responses poured in. People had a lot of opinions, and it became clear that this situation wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Some people sided with us, saying Dad was being selfish, while others pointed out that maybe we were being too hard on him since he was grieving too. It was eye-opening but didn't make the decision any easier. Now, with the memorial just around the corner, we're at a breaking point. We haven't even finalized the details because we don't know if Dad will be there, and the idea of him showing up with Kim is hanging over all of us like a dark cloud. It's a mess. And honestly, I'm not sure how this is going to play out. Update 1. After posting on Reddit about our situation, I got flooded with responses. Most people agreed with us, saying Dad was moving on too quickly, and that bringing Kim to the memorial was disrespectful. A few comments suggested that maybe we were being too harsh, and that Dad was just trying to cope with his grief in his own way. It made me realize that outside of our family, opinions varied, but it didn't make things any easier. Just as we were starting to sort through the feedback, Dad called and threw another wrench into things. He was frustrated and told us that if we didn't accept Kim coming to the memorial, he would hold a separate ceremony for Mom. It felt like he was trying to put us in a corner, forcing us to choose between having him at the memorial with Kim or not having him there at all. This new ultimatum created a deeper divide between us. Word of the situation spread even more within our family. Our aunts, Dad's sisters weren't shy about their opinions. They thought it was inappropriate for Dad to bring a new girlfriend to such a personal event and confronted him about it. Dad snapped back, accusing them of interfering in his life and not understanding his grief. The whole thing turned into a shouting match that left both sides feeling bitter. Suddenly, it wasn't just our immediate family involved. The tension had spilled over into the extended family, and everyone had something to say. Meanwhile, Emma was taking it the hardest. She'd always been close to Mom and had been looking forward to the memorial as a way to honor her memory. Seeing the focus shift to drama over Dad's relationship was too much for her. One night, she broke down, sobbing about how she couldn't believe this was what Mom's memory was being reduced to. Zach and I tried to comfort her, but the whole thing just felt like a mess that we couldn't fix. As if things weren't complicated enough, Kim escalated her involvement. She sent a long email to the three of us, apologizing for any pain she might have caused. She claimed that she never intended to drive a wedge between Dad and us, and that she just wanted to support him. But the timing and the tone of her message didn't sit right with any of us. It felt more like damage control than a sincere apology, and it only made us angrier. We didn't need her explanations, we needed her to respect our boundaries. I suggested to Dad that maybe we could try family therapy, to have a space where we could all talk things out. But he dismissed the idea outright, saying that therapy wouldn't help because we were being unreasonable. He kept insisting that Kim had done nothing wrong, and that we were the ones creating the problem. It was like talking to a brick wall. I could see how deeply entrenched he'd become in his decision, and it made me worry that we might not be able to find a way through this. Around this time, Zach and I had a candid conversation, and he opened up about some things I hadn't known before. He told me that during Mom's last year, he'd always felt like Dad had checked out emotionally. It was something Zach had never really talked about before, but he said that this whole situation with Kim felt like a continuation of that neglect. It was like Dad was rushing to move on because he couldn't face the past, and it made Zach angrier than he'd let on. Hearing this, I realized just how deep the hurt ran in all of us. With everything so up in the air, we put the memorial planning on hold. We couldn't move forward without knowing whether Dad would attend, and his ultimatum had left us feeling uncertain. We were caught in limbo, waiting for something to give. I reached out to some of Mom's old friends, hoping they could offer some guidance. They were shocked when they heard about Dad's plans. They all agreed that it was too soon for him to bring someone new into the family, and it felt good to know that others saw things the way we did. But even with their support, the situation still felt impossible to untangle. Then, through a mutual friend, we learned some things about Kim's past. It turned out that she had a history of dating older, well-off men. It wasn't hard evidence of anything bad, but it did make us wonder about her motivations. It just added another layer of suspicion that made it even harder for us to see her as just someone trying to help Dad through a tough time. One night, Dad called me out of the blue. He sounded exhausted, like he hadn't slept much. In that late-night call, he admitted that he had been lonely for a long time, even before Mom got sick. He said that his relationship with Mom hadn't been as perfect as it seemed from the outside, and that he had felt isolated for years. It was the first time he had opened up like this, and it made me see his actions in a new light, even if it didn't change how I felt about Kim at the memorial. Emma, in a moment of weakness, considered just letting Kim come to keep the peace. She thought maybe it would be better than tearing the family apart. But Zach and I reminded her that our feelings mattered too, and that it wasn't just about making things easy for Dad. So we stayed firm in our stance, even though it meant more conflict. Then, a few days later, Kim showed up at the church where we used to attend as a family. It felt like she was trying to integrate herself into Dad's life even more, knowing that it was a place full of memories of our mom. It felt like she was pushing her way in, and we made it clear that she wasn't welcome at the memorial if she came with Dad. This led to another blowout between us and Dad, and it seemed like the gap between us was only getting wider. To make matters worse, a cousin who caught wind of the drama decided to post about it on social media. Suddenly, everyone in the extended family knew about our fight, and it became a topic of gossip. People were choosing sides, commenting on our posts, and offering unsolicited advice. It was overwhelming, and it felt like this private struggle had turned into a public spectacle that none of us wanted. And now, with the memorial date getting closer, we're stuck in a tense standoff. Every conversation with Dad feels like walking on eggshells, and none of us know how it's going to end. Update 2. After the last blowout with Dad over the memorial, things went radio silent. He stopped answering our calls and texts, leaving us in the dark about whether he would actually follow through with his threat to hold a separate ceremony. Emma, Zach, and I felt uneasy, like we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't like Dad to go completely off the grid like this, and the thought that he might actually skip Mom's memorial just to be with Kim made everything worse. It wasn't long before Kim decided to add more fuel to the fire. She made a post on Facebook, talking about how difficult it was to be with someone who is unfairly judged by their own family. She didn't mention any names, but it was obvious who she meant. The post got a lot of sympathy comments from people who didn't know the full story, and it sent Emma into a rage. She showed us the post, and we couldn't believe that Kim would take things public like this. It felt like she was trying to paint herself as the victim and turn people against us. As if that wasn't enough, I got a message from a family friend who had heard some troubling news. She mentioned that Dad might be planning to propose to Kim soon. Apparently, he had been seen looking at rings at a local jewelry store. That news hit us like a gut punch. It wasn't even about whether he could or couldn't move on, it was the timing and the way he was going about it. It made everything feel even more rushed, like he was trying to replace Mom as quickly as possible. Zach and I decided we couldn't sit back and let things spiral any further. We drove over to Dad's house, hoping to talk some sense into him before it was too late. But when we got there, he wouldn't even open the door. We could hear him moving around inside, but he ignored us, refusing to come out or even acknowledge we were there. After standing outside for nearly half an hour, we had no choice but to leave. It was like he had put up a wall between us, and no matter what we said or did, he wasn't going to listen. Back at Emma's place, we found some old letters Mom had written to Dad before she got sick. They were tucked away in an old box she kept under her bed. In the letters, Mom had poured out her heart, asking Dad to be more present, to cherish the time they had left together. Reading those words felt like a punch to the chest. It reminded us why we were fighting so hard to keep the focus on Mom's memory. It wasn't just about Kim, it was about all the times Dad hadn't been there when Mom needed him most. In a weird way, all of this brought the three of us closer. We started spending more time together, sharing stories about Mom and leaning on each other to get through the stress of everything with Dad. It was like we were rebuilding our bond in the midst of all this chaos, realizing that, at the end of the day, we only had each other to lean on. A few days after our failed intervention, Dad finally broke his silence, but not in the way we hoped. He sent us a long, rambling message saying he hoped we could find a way to move past this. But the tone of the message felt off. It didn't sound like an olive branch. It sounded more like he was saying goodbye, like he was preparing to go through with his separate memorial. It left us wondering if this was his way of trying to cut ties without coming out and saying it. With the memorial date approaching and no confirmation from Dad, we had to prepare for the possibility that he wouldn't come. We resumed planning without him, focusing on making it a special day for Mom. But it was impossible to shake the tension hanging over us. It felt like we were planning for two possible outcomes, a memorial with Dad and a memorial without him. Around this time, a mutual friend told us that they overheard Kim bragging to some acquaintances about how she had changed Dad's life for the better. It didn't sit right with us. It made it seem like she thought she was some kind of savior swooping in to rescue him from his grief. Hearing that only deepened our suspicions that her intentions might not be as pure as she tried to make them seem. Then, out of nowhere, Zach ran into Dad at a local diner. He looked worn out, like he hadn't been sleeping. They ended up having a long talk, and for the first time, Dad let his guard down. He broke down, admitting that he felt like he had lost everything after Mom died, and that Kim made him feel like he had a reason to keep going. He talked about how empty the house felt without Mom and how he couldn't stand being alone with his thoughts. But even in his vulnerability, he made it clear that he felt like he had no choice. Kim was part of his future now, whether we liked it or not. Zach told us about the conversation, and it just made everything feel more complicated. We didn't want Dad to feel alone, but it felt like he was choosing Kim over us. And we couldn't ignore the fact that he had kept pushing to bring her into this part of our lives without considering how it affected us. As we continued with the memorial plans, Emma found some old photo albums from when our parents were younger. They were filled with pictures of family vacations, holidays, and simple moments at home. Looking through those photos brought back a flood of memories. It made us miss Mom even more and reminded us why we wanted this memorial to be about her, not the drama surrounding Dad's new relationship. Our aunt, seeing how tense things had become, offered to host the memorial at her place. She told us that, given everything that had happened, Dad was no longer welcome there if he insisted on bringing Kim. It was a tough call, but we agreed, grateful to have a backup plan in case things with Dad fell through entirely. The night before the memorial, Dad finally reached out. He called, sounding hesitant, and said that he'd come alone. but he made it clear that he still expected us to meet Kim soon, even if it wasn't at the memorial. It felt like a small victory, but it didn't solve the bigger issues. We agreed to talk to Kim after the memorial, but it was obvious that things between us and Dad were still far from being okay. With the memorial just a day away, the tension was thick, and none of us knew what would happen next. Update 3. The day of the memorial arrived, and we didn't know what to expect. Dad had promised he'd come alone, but we weren't sure if he'd keep his word. We gathered at our aunt's place, which she'd graciously offered as a safe space to remember Mom. The atmosphere was somber, with a mix of family, close friends, and people who had known Mom for decades. The air was heavy with shared memories, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Dad to arrive. About an hour in, Dad showed up. True to his word, he was alone, but he looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red, and he had this lost expression on his face. It was clear that this whole situation had taken a toll on him. He walked in quietly, trying to avoid eye contact, but you could see the weight he was carrying. For a moment, it seemed like we might be able to get through the day without any more drama. The ceremony itself was emotional. We had set up a table with photos of Mom from different stages of her life, and people took turns sharing stories about her, how she'd always been the first to help a neighbor, how she could make anyone feel welcome. Dad asked to say a few words, and as he started speaking, his voice cracked. He talked about how much he missed her and how he realized too late how much she had meant to him. He broke down in front of everyone, and it was impossible not to feel the impact of his grief. It wasn't what any of us expected, but in that moment, it felt like he was finally being honest. Seeing him like that brought out a lot of emotions. It was the first time in months that I'd seen him so vulnerable. Emma was crying, and even Zach, who'd been so angry, seemed to soften a bit. Dad apologized for the way he had handled things since Mom's passing, admitting that he hadn't considered how all of this would affect us. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it felt like the start of something. Just when we thought the day might end on a peaceful note, Kim showed up at the reception afterward. She walked in looking a bit nervous and said she only wanted to pay her respects to Mom. It caught everyone off guard, especially since Dad had promised to come alone. There was a tense silence as she made her way in, and you could feel the room shift. Emma and I decided to talk to her, trying to keep things civil. We told her that this wasn't the time or place for her to be there, and she fired back, saying she didn't understand why we were making things so difficult. It turned into a confrontation, with her accusing us of trying to control Dad's life. That's when Zach lost it. He stepped in, raising his voice, telling Kim that she would never replace our mom and that she had no right to be there. It got heated fast, and suddenly all eyes were on us. Dad, seeing things spiral out of control, tried to step in, asking everyone to calm down. But it was too late. The damage was done. We felt betrayed that he had let Kim show up at all after promising us she wouldn't be there. The tension in the room was unbearable, and our aunt decided to end the reception early, sending people home before things could get worse. It wasn't the peaceful goodbye to Mom that we'd hoped for, but at least it was over. That night, after everyone had left, Dad came over to Emma's house. He looked drained, like he had aged 10 years in a single day. We sat down in the living room, and for the first time in a long while, we had a real conversation. He admitted that he had been struggling with a lot of regrets, how he had been emotionally distant during Mom's illness, how he had let work come first for so long. He said he wished he could take it all back, but he knew he couldn't. We didn't forgive him right away, but we talked about how much pain this whole situation had caused all of us. Kim called Zach later that night, trying to explain herself, saying she never wanted to replace our mom. But by then, it was too little, too late. None of us were in the mood to hear her out, and Zach hung up without much of a response. In those quiet hours, Dad opened up about how lonely he had been even before Mom got sick. He said that when Kim came into his life, it felt like she was giving him a chance to start over, and that's why he clung to her so quickly. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it helped us understand where he was coming from. We told him that while we didn't agree with his choices, we didn't want to lose him completely either. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt like we were finally talking instead of just fighting. We ended the night with an agreement to disagree about Kim. Dad understood that it would take time for us to accept her presence in his life, and we agreed to at least try to keep the peace for his sake. He suggested we try seeing a family therapist together, something he had shot down before. Emma had brought up the idea earlier, and now it seemed like he was finally willing to give it a chance. It was a small step, but it felt like a glimpse of hope. Maybe therapy would help us navigate the mess we'd found ourselves in, or maybe it would just give us a chance to say the things we'd been holding back. Either way, it was a start. I updated Reddit afterward, thanking everyone for their support and advice. I shared that while things weren't perfect, there was at least a path forward. The memorial hadn't gone how we planned, and there was still a lot to work through, but we were finally talking instead of tearing each other apart. I didn't know what would happen next, but I hoped that maybe this new chapter would bring us a little bit of peace. Update 4. After the memorial and the tense aftermath with Kim's surprise appearance, we all thought things might calm down. But it turned out that was just the beginning of another round of drama. A few days later, Kim reached out to me directly. She sent me a long message, saying that she understood how difficult all of this had been for our family and asking if we could meet up to talk. She claimed she just wanted to find a way to make things work between us before things got worse. It felt invasive, especially after everything that had already happened. I didn't respond, but the message stuck with me, like she was trying to take control of the situation on her terms. Meanwhile, things between my siblings started to shift in a way I didn't see coming. Zach, who had been so angry before, suddenly started siding with Dad. He pulled me aside one evening and told me that maybe we were being too harsh, that Dad had a right to bring whoever he wanted to the memorial since it was his grief too. He even said I was stuck in the past, clinging to memories of Mom without considering Dad's need to move forward. It felt like a slap in the face after everything we'd been through together, and it quickly turned into a heated argument. Emma tried to mediate, but it was clear that Zach's perspective had changed, and it was driving a wedge between us. Around the same time, one of Mom's closest friends got wind of everything through the family grapevine. She called me, completely shocked that Dad had even considered bringing his new girlfriend to the memorial. She mentioned how it would have broken your mom's heart to see things fall apart like this so soon after she passed. Hearing her say that only made everything feel more real, like it wasn't just us kids who thought Dad was making a mistake. Dad, on the other hand, refused to back down. We tried talking to him again, hoping we could make him understand how much this was hurting us, but he was firm. He kept saying that he had a right to decide who he brought into his life, and that Kim had helped him through so much since Mom's passing. He didn't see why he needed our approval, and it was clear that he wasn't going to change his mind. After hitting yet another wall, we tried a different approach. Emma, Zach, and I sat down and wrote a heartfelt letter to Dad. We outlined how much Mom's memory meant to us, and why we believed she deserved a day focused entirely on her without any added tension. We told him that it wasn't about keeping Kim out of his life forever, just about giving us time to adjust. We went over to his house and delivered the letter in person, hoping it might reach him in a way our conversations hadn't. He took the letter, but we could tell from his expression that it wasn't going to change his mind. A few days later, Dad invited us over for dinner, saying he wanted to clear the air. Reluctantly, we agreed, hoping that maybe this could be a chance for reconciliation. But when we arrived, it became clear that he had a different plan. He had invited Kim to the dinner as well, and he acted like this was his way of bringing us all together. It quickly turned into a tense and awkward gathering. Every attempt at small talk fell flat, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Then, halfway through dinner, Kim made a comment that changed everything. She hinted that if we couldn't accept her, Dad might have to make a choice between being with her or staying close to us. The room went dead silent. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and I couldn't stay there after that. I got up and walked out, unable to listen to any more. Emma followed right behind me, leaving Dad and Zach at the table with Kim. It felt like the family was splitting in two right there and then. Later that night, Zach called me, but it wasn't to apologize. He accused me of overreacting and being the reason the family was falling apart. He said that if I couldn't get over my issues with Kim, he might have to side with Dad for the sake of keeping things peaceful. Hearing him say that felt like losing an ally, and it left me feeling more isolated than ever. The next morning, Dad called and delivered another blow. He told me that he was canceling the memorial arrangements we'd made together, saying he would hold a smaller, private gathering with just a few close friends and Kim. It was a shock. All the planning, all the effort we'd put into making it a special day for Mom, and he had just wiped it away. It felt like a betrayal, like he was choosing his new relationship over honoring her memory. After that call, I broke down in front of my partner. Everything had built up, Dad's refusal to listen, Zach turning against me, the constant tension, and I didn't know if I should keep fighting or just give in for the sake of peace. My partner listened patiently, trying to help me see the bigger picture, but it was hard to see a way out that didn't leave us all broken. I turned back to Reddit, sharing the latest updates. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people commented, urging me to stand firm for the sake of my mom's memory and calling out Dad's insensitivity. It helped to know that so many others saw things the way I did, but it didn't change the reality of what was happening within our family. Some of our extended family members reached out too. My aunt and a cousin called, offering their support and venting about how disappointed they were in Dad's decision. They shared their frustrations, but like us, they felt powerless to change his mind. It was comforting to know they were on our side, but it also made the divide feel even bigger. Then I got a call from the funeral home director. He had heard that Dad was changing the plans and wanted to know if we still intended to hold a memorial for Mom. He offered to help us organize a separate ceremony if we wanted to proceed without Dad's involvement. It was a generous offer, but it left us with a tough decision to make. Emma, always the practical one, suggested we could pool our resources and cover the costs ourselves if needed. She was willing to help pay for an alternate memorial, making the idea feel more like a real option. But it wasn't just about money, it was about deciding whether to go forward with our own plans or to try one last time to convince Dad to include us in his. We sat down that night knowing we had to make a choice. Would we stand our ground for Mom's sake, or would we keep trying to reach Dad even if it felt like a lost cause? It felt like the future of our family depended on what we decided next. Update 5. After Dad canceled our original memorial plans and decided to hold his own private gathering with Kim, Emma and I made a difficult decision. We couldn't let Mom's memory go uncelebrated just because of the rift between us and Dad, so we decided to plan a separate memorial for her. It would take place on the same day as Dad's gathering, but it would be in the local park where she loved to take us when we were kids. It wasn't an easy choice. Part of us felt guilty for splitting the family further, but we were determined to honor her in a way that felt right. We had a tough time deciding who to invite. Should we let the extended family know or keep it small? In the end, we spread the word quietly to those who had been closest to Mom, like her best friend and a few of her old friends. They were immediately supportive, saying they'd rather celebrate Mom's life without the drama. It felt good to know that others were on the same page, even though it made the divide between us and Dad feel even wider. 2 days before the memorial, Dad called me. The conversation was tense from the start. He insisted that Kim would be attending his private gathering and tried to convince me to come, saying we needed to come together as a family. I told him about our alternate memorial, and he was stunned. He called it a slap in the face, saying we were tearing the family apart. But I stood my ground, explaining that this wasn't about hurting him. It was about remembering Mom in a way that felt true to us. We ended the call without any resolution, and I had a feeling things would only get worse. That night, I received a long, emotional message from Kim. She accused me of forcing Dad to choose between us and claimed that I was driving a wedge in the family. She tried to guilt-trip me, talking about how much she had done for Dad since Mom's passing. But instead of making me second-guess our decision, it just strengthened my resolve. I ignored the message and focused on the memorial plans with Emma. Then, the day before the memorial, Zach dropped a bombshell. He told us he had decided to attend Dad's private gathering instead of our memorial. He said he didn't want to abandon Dad during such a tough time, even if he didn't fully agree with everything Dad was doing. It was a punch to the gut, and it deepened the rift between us. Zach even went as far as to accuse us of being selfish, saying we were too focused on making a point instead of being there for Dad. It hurt, but Emma and I decided to move forward with our plans anyway. On the morning of the memorial, something unexpected happened. A few of our extended family members who had originally planned to attend Dad's gathering showed up at the park instead. They said they didn't feel comfortable with the idea of celebrating Mom's life with Kim there and wanted to pay their respects in a more peaceful setting. It was a relief to see familiar faces who supported our decision, and it gave us the strength to go through with the day. The memorial itself was simple but heartfelt. We set up a table with photos of Mom, pictures of family vacations, holidays, and even just everyday moments. People took turns sharing stories, and there were a lot of laughs mixed with tears. It was bittersweet, but it felt like we were finally able to focus on Mom's memory instead of the drama that had consumed our lives for months. It wasn't the big event we had originally planned, but it was filled with love and warmth. But of course, it didn't stay peaceful for long. Halfway through the ceremony, Kim showed up. She walked in, looking serious, and said she wanted to pay her respects. Her arrival caused a stir with whispers rippling through the group. Some of Mom's friends, who had known her for years, were visibly upset. One of them stepped forward and politely but firmly asked Kim to leave. There was a brief exchange, with Kim insisting she had a right to be there, but eventually she turned and left, clearly frustrated. It was awkward, but it kept the focus where it needed to be, on Mom. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Dad called me. He was furious. He accused me of turning the family against him and said that by holding a separate memorial, I had disrespected both him and Kim. He went on a tirade, saying things that can't be taken back, like telling me I was no longer welcome at his house as long as I kept rejecting his new relationship. It felt like he was drawing a line in the sand, and I realized we might not be able to come back from this. Not long after that call, Zach reached out too, but it wasn't to make amends. He told me he was done with this drama and wouldn't speak to me again until I apologized to Dad and accepted Kim into the family. It felt like losing a piece of the family all over again, but I couldn't bring myself to compromise my principles. Emma and I stuck together, but it was clear that the divide between us and Dad, between us and Zach, was deeper than ever. After the memorial, Mom's best friend pulled me aside. She revealed something that made everything even more complicated. She said she had known about Dad's relationship with Kim starting earlier than he claimed. It sounded like their relationship might have overlapped with Mom's final months. It wasn't solid proof, but it added another layer of betrayal, making the whole situation feel even messier. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Dad. It was a mix of apology and justification. He wrote about how abandoned he felt after Mom's death and how Kim gave him a reason to keep going. It was heartfelt in parts, but he still didn't seem to understand the hurt he had caused. It was like he was trying to explain himself without really owning up to the pain he'd inflicted. In the midst of everything, I decided to start seeing a therapist. I realized that I needed help processing the grief, the anger, and the family conflict. Emma came with me for a few sessions, and we hoped that maybe, in time, we could start to rebuild something with Dad. But it was clear that it wouldn't be easy. A month after everything went down, Zach sent a short message. He wasn't ready to reconcile, but he admitted that he didn't handle things right and regretted how it all turned out. It wasn't much, but it was a step, and it gave me a small hope that maybe one day, things could change. Looking back, the memorials had divided us, but they also gave us a sense of closure. Emma and I felt proud for standing up for Mom's memory, even if it meant losing some connections along the way. I don't know if our family will ever be the same, but I have hope that, with time, we might find a way to heal. For now, we're just taking things one day at a time.